are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The great public intellectual and anthropologist David Graeber, the late David Graeber, was a friend of this program, appeared with us several times, wrote in one of his books, ironically, that perhaps one of the lasting impacts Abbie Hoffman, the late great activist Abbie Hoffman, made on the American military is that he forced the Pentagon to change its tactics from the use of young American lives in the waging of war, although it's still doing that, to a much greater emphasis on the technological instrumentalities of death. As a result, as my next guest is going to discuss with us, we have seen a phenomenon that Norman Solomon calls war made invisible. That is, in fact, the title of his latest book, War Made Invisible. Norman Solomon has been on the program before. He is a longtime activist, writer, media critic, journalist. He is a co-founder or founder of two organizations I consider very important. One is Roots Action, which is at rootsaction.org. The other is the Institute for Public Accuracy. And as I say, his latest book is entitled War Made Invisible. So without any further ado, Norman Solomon, welcome back to the program.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
Let's start with this. War Made Invisible. Why that title, and what called you to write it now?
Well, people were generally fairly aware in the United States that the country was at war early on in this century. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, in 2001 and 2003. But gradually, as the saying goes, the boots on the ground became fewer and fewer in overseas conflicts. There was more and more, and is more and more, reliance on air power. So that's one factor, because U.S. media coverage and politics are so focused on us, the United States, Americans, and what's considered newsworthy and politically salient and important often, usually, revolves around Americans. And so when it's more and more of a push-button remote war, and loved ones and combatants are not very much involved, it becomes an abstraction. And the absence of the coverage, of the consciousness, of the awareness melts into thin air, even the reality that the warfare is going on, even though indeed, as we speak, it is going on courtesy of U.S. taxpayers.
And, implicit, I think, on every page of your book, Norman, is the moral obligation we have as Americans to understand what is being done with our resources and in our name and the human impact of that. So why don't we begin with a kind of a broad overview, if you will. You and I are old enough to remember the draft, to remember when American military engagement in Vietnam was a matter of immediate concern to many, if not most, American families, when our own lives seemed to and did hang in the balance as a result of that. We've moved increasingly towards, obviously we have many veterans in this country of more recent wars, many wounded veterans who have been done a disservice by this sort of collective imposition of amnesia. But the other thing that struck me about it, and one of the reasons why I commend you for writing this book, is it seems to me there's also been a shift on the left, that whereas 50 years ago, maybe not everyone, left is a nebulous term, but we had a warlike president in Lyndon B. Johnson and so on, but an anti-war presence was a clear part of the Democratic Party, whether it was Eugene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy, George McGovern, whomever, and there was a mobilized movement against war that lasted, I would say, into the 1980s and the anti-nuclear movement. And it seems to me that one of the things that's changed, but I'd love your thoughts on that before we get into the specifics of the book. It seems to me that one of the things that has changed is that the left, broadly defined, has lost focus on this, or even in many cases become more supportive of militarization than not. Do you have, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are many factors. A lot of them revolve around the partisan divide and how that gets framed and reframed, and the so-called leadership of the two major parties, such as they are. And I think we could even identify it as this century, specifically after 9/11 and the advent of the so-called war on terror, which is really still going on, even with much lower profile. There always, I think, has been a split or a division spectrum within the Democratic Party, which was, after all, certainly on Capitol Hill and even the base, supportive of Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War for quite a while, but gradually turned in that way. In the 1980s, there was real division over supporting Ronald Reagan's wars, the invasions of Grenada and Panama, then the latter being the first President Bush. And then in the 21st century, right after 9/11, I point out in the book that when the United States launched its attack on Afghanistan a few weeks after 9/11, so October 2001, a Gallup poll found that 90% of the U.S. public supported the impending attack. 5% were opposed. Well, that's almost, official Soviet-style opinion, because if you got only 1 out of 20 opposed to your country launching an attack on a country that had nothing to do with 9/11 in that case, it tells you something about the strength of the combined media and political messaging from the political establishment, from the mainstream media, which was at play and certainly in play for a while. But then the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and a division on the liberal left spectrum, but especially among Democrats. So Republicans uniting behind George W. Bush as president, launching this war on Iraq based on lies. And the Democratic Party, and reflected in the vote in October 2002 about going to war in Iraq, a real split in the Democratic Party. And as the war became less popular, most of the Democratic Party leaders, and certainly the base, were against this war. But if you fast forward to 2016, the loss by Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump called for and required an explanation. And that explanation was devised, as the book Shattered by a couple of political reporters documented. It required and got in 24 hours an explanation. It wasn't because Hillary Clinton and the top of the Democratic Party was too close to Wall Street and corporate America. It wasn't because she got six-figure fees for speaking to corporate entities that were exploiting the workers and the consumers of America. No, they decided the night after Hillary Clinton lost the presidency to blame Russia. And that had tremendous long-term implications because it was just the beginning. We may remember a few years earlier when Obama ran for re-election, he mocked Romney in a debate, saying, oh, you're living in the past when you say Russia's an enemy. No, by 2016, 2017, the Democratic Party line and then the so-called Russiagate imbroglio and the media messaging and political messaging around that, and politicians like Adam Schiff, Democrats jumping on the hobby horse. Republicans are the real threat to America, or rather, Russia is the big threat to America, when the right wing was gathering steam. So the great irony, I would say, Richard, or one of them, is that the Democratic Party, the pundits, outlets like MSNBC, Rachel Maddow on that network, rising in the popularity and the ratings and so forth, those entities, the Democratic Party aligned media, centrist media, and the Democratic Party leadership, they were able to move ahead and gin up a militarism aimed at Russia. And so that has, a lot of follow through right now. And it has something to do with, quite a bit to do, I think, with how the left right, if you would, partisan divide around militarism no longer is what it used to be. And then we have to factor in last year and a half or so the totally unjustified invasion of Ukraine by Russia really nailed all that down, solidified all that. And I would just sum up by saying that if we could rewind the tape and go back to the middle of the last decade and have a real commitment from the political elites to diplomacy, to seeing the world not just through the White House windows, not just painting the window on the world red, white, and blue. And if diplomacy were really taken seriously, and the national security concerns, not just of the USA, but of Russia, or for that matter, China, were also considered in policy, then we might not have the war in Ukraine, and we might not have this terrible gin-up of militarism that continues.
And one of the problems with this situation that you've so well described, Norman Solomon, is that it becomes difficult for me, I mean, and I'm sure for many people who write about this, who discuss this kind of thing, to talk even with longtime friends who feel that to raise, for example, diplomacy or the historical factors that went into Russia's indefensible, inhumane invasion of Ukraine, to characterize any of it as anything other than a clear battle of good between evil, where evil must be vanquished and good can do no wrong. In other words, to try to ground it in real world context, you're Putin's puppet, or you're treacherous. And John Bolton, who I think just to pick a random name, and his associates, the neoconservatives, who was widely understood among liberals and Democrats in the 2000s, the first decade of the century, were mendacious and destructive people, are now the trustworthy sources, and historical context is something to be shunned. I find it all quite frightening. It's one of the reasons why I think your book is so important, but it disturbs me. And, I don't want to speak for you, but I would imagine it's disturbing to you as well.
It's very disturbing. And we're at a place right now politically and in the mass media where diplomacy has become a dirty word. And the world has been divided conceptually into, as you refer to, good versus evil. Well, there is good and evil, but to demarcate the countries of the world that way really is reminiscent, and the forces in the world reminiscent of what was mocked by some people when George W. Bush did it. He said, it is a battle between good and evil. It was criticized quite rightly as a kind of Manichaean view of the world. And yet a lot of that has really taken hold now. And it is an underlying assumption that only the United States has the prerogative to define what its own national security concerns are. And so even though this analogy seems obvious, it is rarely heard that if there were a military alliance involving Russia, and they had a coalition with, say, Mexico or Canada, and forces and missiles were positioned and deployed along the US-Canada border, that would be absolutely intolerable in Washington. And the US government would not put up with it whatsoever. And yet that is the situation with the expansion of NATO up to Russia's border. Even Radio Free Europe has reported that the ABM, ostensibly defensive missiles along the Polish, Russian, Romanian, Russian border, they're defensive, quote unquote, but they can be quickly retrofitted into offensive weapons. So it's just to say that if we set aside the perceptions of other countries and assume they don't matter, and there's sort of a jingo narcissism that kicks in, and it's all about us, well, we know where that path leads. This is not going to be, though, a unipolar world anymore, economically or even militarily. So I would just sort of sum up by saying, where does all this lead? Where does the supposedly courageous, moralistic cheerleading of saying to Ukrainians, great, you keep fighting, you keep killing and being killed, where does it all lead? And I was lucky enough to work with Daniel Ellsberg, and we put together an article that The Nation magazine published a couple of years ago about the ICBMs, the land-based nuclear missiles that are on hair trigger alert. And at a time of crisis and tensions and paranoia like this, that tripwire, that hair trigger is even more dangerous. Is it an incoming flock of geese? Is it incoming missiles? So what is the end point? What is the end game of all this cheerleading, pouring the weapons in, considering diplomacy to be a dirty word? The odds of nuclear holocaust are being increased by a bipartisan policy out of Washington, cheerleaded by corporate media.
And, maybe a banal thought, Norman, but I was thinking as you were talking about the fact that in the 1980s, when Prince recorded his first album, he had a song on it called Ronnie Talk to Russia when Reagan was president. I can only imagine that if an up-and-coming musician had a song, album with a song called Biden Talk to Russia, that he wouldn't get the chance to record a second album. And it seems to me there's just an enormous kind of Cold War suppression of certain opinions. But of course, the point being that diplomacy is what we do with people we don't agree with and people who are often our strategic enemies, right? I mean, that's the whole point. And there was a time when the liberal point of view was we need to talk to our enemies. We need to de-escalate. We need to reduce the fear of nuclear war. And it seems to me that one difference between now and the first Cold War, if I may call it that, is that at least we were all extremely aware then of the risk of nuclear disaster. We had Dan Ellsberg on this show to talk about ICBMs. I remember your article with him. It seems to me now we're charging ahead with various provocations without even thinking about the risk, whether it's F-16s, whether it's Abrams tanks, whether it's now cluster munitions, that every red line our own government has drawn under President Biden to say, no, that would be too much. We're now crossing one after another, rushing headlong into who knows what. Is that a fair description, you think?
Oh, I completely agree. And if, as they say, there was a band trying to market Biden Talk to Russia, they would likely get the Dixie Chicks treatment that right. band got when they said that they were not happy to be from Texas, where President George W. Bush was from as he continued the war on Iraq. And a major problem is that history is being destroyed. And it's just down the Orwellian memory hole. Let's think about the spirit of Glassboro. Now, we should face it that the Brezhnev-Kosygin regime of the Soviet Union, it was very repressive. And they had that government was about to roll tanks into Hungary the next year. And they certainly were sending people off to Siberia, horrible regime. And yet, in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson received the head of the Soviet government, Alexei Kosygin, and they met for days and days. And they issued a joint statement and said, we have got to prevent nuclear war. We have right. got to have dialogue, understand each other's points of view. If a politician on Capitol Hill gave essentially the speech that Lyndon Johnson gave at Glassboro, they would be trashed as fellow travelers to Kremlin, et cetera, in one phrase or another. That tells us how much this has deteriorated. And I think it's really necessary that we recognize we must turn this around. It's a political battle. It's a media battle. It has to be done. The cliche applies, cooler heads need to prevail. And I don't want to pick on Barbara Lee, but the fact is that she has led, in many ways, in her district here in Northern California, the courageous congresswoman, the only person to vote against the blank check for war a few days after 9/11. But Congresswoman Lee, for 5 or 6 years, like so many of her Democratic Party comrades in Congress, has been beating the drum against Russia. And I dialogued with her. I eventually wrote an article for Huffington Post and another for the San Francisco Chronicle at the time. And I'm talking 5, 6 years ago. And I said, in this case, Barbara Lee does not speak for me because she had condemned the very idea that President Trump would have a meeting with Vladimir Putin. When we're condemning the idea that the leader of one nuclear superpower would even talk to another, it shows just how bad a shape we are in and how far we have to go to get back away from what Martin Luther King Jr. called the madness of militarism.
And it's striking to me the extent to which the sentiments of the first decade of this year have shifted. The fact is, it was widely understood that President George W. Bush, with his 20% approval rating while in office, with a virtually unanimous condemnation among Democrats and many Republicans for the process of lying the United States into war and so on. Dick Cheney is widely understood to be as evil as I believe he is. Your book, War Made Invisible, recounts the way in which, I usually summarize it by saying George W. Bush's reputation was rehabilitated by Democrats because he gave a piece of candy to Michelle Obama. And, may not be entirely fair to the First Lady, but I don't think unfair either, because she talked about how she and he share fundamentally the same values. Dick Cheney being celebrated. It seemed to me as if hatred of Trump became so all-encompassing that anyone, no matter how despicable their past, who criticized Trump became a hero in their eyes. And it seemed to me that this represents amnesia, the kind of amnesia your book discusses, not only about 40, 50 years ago, but about 10, 15 years ago.
It's very important, not only about history, but it's prefigurative for the future. The messaging that is coming from and has been coming from leading Democrats at the top of the party for years is forgive and forget. Part of it got the impetus when even President Obama came in and the question of torture under the Bush administration was raised. And he said, we need to look forward, not backward. That's a way of erasing history. And so when we get the messaging now, and this is cultural from Ellen DeGeneres, who made a point of pointing out that she was friends with and showed video of her on her show with the former President George W. Bush. As you say, First Lady Michelle Obama saying she shares the same values as former President George W. Bush. Well, that is a very clear message that the crimes of the past, the lies that lead the United States into war, the tens of thousands of Americans killed or wounded by those wars, the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, after all, it's no big deal. Forgive and forget. And it's also a cultural and political message that the next lies and the next wars based on deception, they won't really in the long run matter much either.
And the forgive and forget attitude, Norman, is presented as somehow a morally superior position. It seems to me as if, people like you or me who don't think we should forget, much less, in my case anyway, forgive, that we are somehow vindictive or small-minded or mean-spirited, as opposed to what I think is one of the fundamental themes of your book, which is it's not about revenge. I mean, I don't think you explicitly state this, but it's clear in the presentation of the book that we're not talking about revenge or bitterness, or we're talking about the need to understand the forces at work in our society and in our government that led to this, and we need to make a reckoning with it, because if we don't, it will happen again and again, not only causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, but potentially endangering the species. Is that? I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but that was one of my takeaways.
That's right. That's where the war train is headed in terms of confrontation of nuclear superpowers. Making diplomacy something that should be avoided out of some sort of national pseudo-patriotism and so forth. When we talk about moral purity, here we have President Biden, who exactly a year ago fist bumped the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, who with U.S. help has for about 8 years now led the war on Yemen, causing the largest cholera epidemic in history, causing, according to the UN, almost 400,000 deaths in the country of Yemen. United States, an accessory to that, the president of the USA fist bumping the leader of the country, who in turn is leading that war. And we are morally superior. We are on a high horse to say that the United States leads the world for decency and honor. It doesn't let Russia off the hook, but it does say that to get into the good versus evil moralism is really not helpful. And one way that we could put it is that there's no justification for why Russia invaded and is making war on Ukraine. There is an explanation. And it's important that we understand why it happened, multifactorial, granted, but when the US pushes NATO up against Russia's borders, again, do as we say, not as we do, is not convincing in the long run to people of the world. And if the US says we can do it to another major power, but we will not tolerate any abrogation of the Monroe Doctrine of our hemisphere, this is problematic. The US does not get to dictate to the world how people think. It's just not going to pan out.
I was struck at the NATO, in his case, prior to attending the NATO gathering, by Mr. Zelensky's comment about the debate about Ukraine's admission to NATO. Indecision is weakness, he said, and it seems to me that people rightly say we don't have the right to dictate to Ukraine what they do with their country. They are an sovereign country. We can't tell them, their leader, how to govern, but we can tell our leaders how to govern. We can choose for ourselves. And the moral choice for us, given the context that you provide in the book, is not, well, we're telling Zelensky what to do. It's we're telling ourselves, we're retaining our own autonomy. We're not going to be shamed into doing something that's against what we believe to be our best interest, Ukraine's best interest, the world's best interest, which is why we're seeing a diminishment of enthusiasm even among European allies. But, Ukraine gets us to another very important point you make in the book, Norman, which is the racism that is sort of endemic in this worldview when we contrast, and certainly in media, you're a longtime media critic. There's a lot of, you bring back a lot of horrific memories of the way the U.S. media covered the wars of the last 20, 25 years, the cheerleading and so on. But you also bring up the covert and sometimes overt, these are, it's striking in Ukraine because these are people that look like us. I think one reporter said, blue eyes, white skin, blonde hair, whatever it was. Of course, entirely forgetting that not all of us have blue eyes or blonde hair or white skin. But more importantly, the fact that even the sort of liberal democratic supporters of this war machine have, in fact, in my view anyway, dehumanize brown-skinned peoples who are dying as a result of our own actions. And that to me is striking. To me, it's one reason why we've shown insufficient compassion to the victims of Yemen, that whose torment we aided for so long through Saudi Arabia, insufficient compassion for our own victims in Afghanistan. You talk about the withholding of Afghanistan funds by the Biden administration. We could go on, but the idea that underlying a lot of this is our concern for quote unquote people like us versus people who are quote unquote not like us. And I'm not sure how you break that cycle, but I think it starts with naming it, which you do, for what it is, which to me anyway, I would simply put as racism.
It does start with naming it. And you're reminding me of how I end the book, which is a quote from James Baldwin. And he says that not everything that we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless we face it. And it's stunning to me that, for good reason, in the last few years, after the murder of George Floyd and the resulting demonstrations and public discourse, the phrase systemic racism has been in wide circulation, which I think is really good. And we need to talk about it and examine and push for fundamental change to address the reality of systemic racism. And yet, tacitly, the assumption is that systemic racism in government policy stops at the water's edge. That, oh yes, we do have systemic racism in the United States that affects domestic policy, but somehow we, by omission, are told that it doesn't apply and doesn't have an effect on foreign policy. And that is preposterous. I think it's so true what you're referring to, Richard, because this is part of what affects U.S. policy in terms of individual prejudices, whether we as individuals have personal, conscious or unconscious, racial, cultural, ethnic prejudices, and also in terms of the institutions of the United States, the mass media, the governmental agencies, all of that. So it would be fantasy land if we actually looked at it and thought about it very clearly. It'd be a fantasy to believe that this systemic racism that we know exists in the United States inside our borders and policy that's domestic, somehow we're supposed to assume it doesn't affect our overseas policy, how the media is covering wars and policies. And I make a clear point, I think, in the book. I say, let's be emphatic about this. The United States government does not bomb a country because it's inhabited by people of color. But if the country is inhabited by people of color, it makes it easier for the United States to engage in warfare on that country. And I was many months into working on this book, and I eventually came up with a chapter titled Color of War. It was a long time before I clearly realized that since the beginning of the so-called war on terror, so we're talking more than 20 years, almost all the victims of U.S. firepower have been people of color.
Right.
And to be candid, I have written pieces with that point, sent it to the New York Times, sent it to the Washington Post. I can't get it in a major media outlet. One simple op-ed piece making that point. It's not as though, oh, we've published other articles on that point. It's almost like truth that must not be spoken.
And of course, if I recall correctly, our armed forces are also disproportionately black and brown. So that even applies, I would assume, to our American war casualties as well. And, I think Rudyard Kipling, of all people, said something to the effect that a nation in a decline becomes a shadow of itself. And it seems to me that when we talk about militarization, when we talk about the racist dimension of that you mentioned Black Lives Matter, the policing, the fact that we ship so much military armamenture to our police forces. We've militarized our domestic police to an extent that, as we saw during a number of incidents in Black Lives Matter, we find our governments, local and state and national, treating our own black and brown citizens a little bit differently and less humanely than they might have. So I guess as a closing note, I mean, to me, one of the important things about this conversation that your book triggers is what it does to the moral injury that it does to ourselves as a society, and the negative traits, whether it be racism, tribalism, if I can use that word, jingoism, that it promotes and emphasizes at a time when we should be resisting those. But I'll give you the last word.
Well, I think moral injury is quite an appropriate phrase. Another one is what goes around comes around. And when we have had protesters by the many thousands in the streets after the George Floyd murder to address the systemic racism in the so-called Justice Department and law enforcement, those demonstrators in many cities faced off against Pentagon weapons in the hands of local police through what's called the 1033 program, gratis given, often weapons that were in Afghanistan or Iraq, MRAPs or tanks or whatever, essentially provided to those police forces. And I think about something that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke on back in 1967. We all have heard many times through mass media, I have a dream, 1963. But by 1967, the anti-war spokesperson and activist, Martin Luther King Jr., virtually off the mass media map for decades. And in his speech at Riverside Church, exactly a year before he died, he described military spending out of control as a demonic suction tube. His words, a demonic suction tube. And here we are in 2023, and you go to virtually any metropolitan area or town or rural area for that matter, and you see a lack of healthcare, education, housing, infant care, elderly care. The list is very, very long, very deep, and very pervasive. And yet that disconnect between the militarism of the spending priorities and what we suffer from at home, that cord has been largely cut. It's been cut by mass media. There are few politicians in Washington who talk about it, and yet it's very real in our daily lives.
My guest has been Norman Solomon. His latest book is War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. Norman, thank you for your great work in writing this book. I encourage people to read it. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thank you, Richard, and many thanks for the 0 Hour.
Thank you. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the 0 Hour.